He sat quietly outside the grocery store, an 82-year-old man catching his breath after a long walk to buy bread with his last $5, when three drunk college kids decided he looked like the perfect target for their cruel entertainment. They kicked him repeatedly while calling him a homeless dog. But when their boots tore his shirt open, revealing a Navy SEAL silent death tattoo on his weathered chest, the store owner who witnessed it through the window knew immediately that these punks had just made the worst mistake of their pathetic lives. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the parking lot of Miller's Grocery, a family-owned store that had been serving the same neighborhood for 37 years. On the wooden bench outside the entrance, a figure sat motionless in the growing shade, an old man who looked like he carried the weight of the world on his shoulders. Marcus Reaper Sullivan was 82 years old, though the harsh lines carved into his face made him appear even older. His gray hair hung thin and unkempt. His clothes bore the permanent wrinkles of someone who owned only what he wore, and his weathered hands shook slightly as they gripped a small plastic bag containing his weekly groceries, a loaf of day-old bread, a can of soup, and a small container of generic peanut butter. Total cost, $4.73. His entire food budget for the week. Marcus had walked 3 miles to reach Miller's Grocery, not because it was the closest store, but because it was the only one that still sold day-old bread at a discount. The walk back home would be another 3 miles, and at his age, with arthritis eating away at his joints and a heart that had seen too much combat stress, he needed these few minutes of rest. He'd been making this same journey every Tuesday for 4 years now, ever since his Social Security checks had been reduced due to some bureaucratic error he couldn't afford to fight. The wooden bench outside Miller's had become his oasis, a place to catch his breath and gather strength for the return trip to his one-room apartment above the laundromat on Elm Street. What the people passing by didn't know was that Marcus Sullivan had once been one of the most feared men alive. For 28 years, he had served with SEAL Team 5, specializing in deep reconnaissance and targeted elimination missions in places that didn't appear on any map. His call sign had been Reaper because of his ability to eliminate high-value targets without a sound, without a trace, without the enemy ever knowing he had been there. Marcus had operated in Vietnam, Cambodia, Nicaragua, Somalia, Iraq, and Afghanistan. He had confirmed kills in double digits, had extracted hostages from impossible situations, and had completed missions so classified that most of his service record was still sealed 40 years after his retirement. But none of that mattered when you were 82 alone and counting coins to buy bread. As Marcus sat on the bench, adjusting the thin jacket that was his only protection against the autumn chill, he noticed 3 young men approaching from across the parking lot, college age, probably early 20s, walking with the unsteady swagger of people who had been drinking for hours even though it was only 3 p.m. on a Tuesday. They wore expensive clothes, designer jeans, brand-name sneakers, university sweatshirts that probably cost more than Marcus spent on food in 2 months. Their voices carried across the parking lot, loud and aggressive, full of the kind of arrogance that came from never having faced real consequences for their actions. "Dude, look at this," one of them said, pointing toward Marcus. He was tall and lean, with perfectly styled hair and the kind of smirk that suggested he'd never been in a real fight in his life. "What?" asked the second one, stockier and wearing a fraternity t-shirt. "Old homeless guy. Just sitting there like he owns the place," the tall one replied. "Probably hasn't showered in weeks." The third member of their group, shorter but with mean eyes and scarred knuckles that suggested he'd thrown punches before, looked Marcus up and down with obvious contempt. "Disgusting," he said, "probably scaring away real customers." Marcus heard them talking but didn't look up. He'd learned long ago that the best way to avoid trouble was to avoid eye contact, to make yourself invisible, to hope that predators would find easier prey. But these 3 weren't looking for easy prey. They were looking for entertainment. "Hey, old man," the tall one called out as they approached the bench. "You can't just sit here all day." Marcus looked up slowly, taking in their faces with the kind of quick assessment that had once kept him alive in hostile territory. 3 young men, intoxicated, looking for someone to hurt. No weapons visible, But drunk people were unpredictable. The smart play was to leave. "I'm just resting," Marcus said quietly, his voice hoarse from years of rarely being used. "I'll be moving along soon." "Yeah, you will," the stocky one said, stepping closer. "This is a business, not a homeless shelter." Marcus began to gather his things, moving with the careful slowness of someone whose body protested every motion. But standing up proved more difficult than he'd expected. The arthritis in his knees had stiffened during his rest, and the simple act of rising from the bench became a struggle. The three college students watched this struggle with cruel amusement. "Look at him," the mean-eyed one laughed. "Can barely even stand up." "Pathetic," agreed the tall one. "What's the point of living when you're that useless?" Marcus finally managed to get to his feet, swaying slightly as he found his balance. He clutched his plastic bag of groceries close to his chest and began to shuffle toward the sidewalk. But they weren't done with him. "Hold up there, Grandpa," the stocky one said, stepping into Marcus's path. "I don't think you heard us. We said you can't just sit here whenever you want." "I'm leaving," Marcus said quietly. "No trouble." "No trouble?" The mean-eyed one laughed harshly. "You're the trouble, old man, sitting out here looking like a corpse, stinking up the place." He shoved Marcus backward. Not hard enough to knock him down, but enough to send him stumbling back toward the bench. "Please," Marcus said, and the word came out weaker than he'd intended. "I just want to go home." The word "please" seemed to ignite something savage in the three young men. They'd found someone who would beg, someone who wouldn't fight back, someone they could hurt without consequences. "Please?" the tall one mocked. "Did you hear that? The old dog is begging." That's when the real violence began. The stocky one kicked Marcus in the stomach, doubling him over and sending his bag of groceries scattering across the concrete. The loaf of bread split open, the can of soup rolled under a parked car, and the peanut butter container cracked against the curb. "Look at that," the mean-eyed one said. "Dog food. That's all he can afford." Marcus tried to crawl toward his scattered groceries, but another kick caught him in the ribs, rolling him onto his back. Pain shot through his chest, ribs that had been broken in combat 40 years ago and never quite healed right. "Stop," he gasped. "Please, just stop." But they didn't stop. If anything, his pleas seemed to encourage them. "What's wrong, old dog?" the tall one taunted, aiming a kick at Marcus's leg. "Not so tough now." Inside Miller's grocery store, owner David Miller was restocking shelves when he heard the commotion outside. At first, he'd ignored it. College kids being loud wasn't unusual in this neighborhood, but something about the tone made him look up, and when he glanced through the front window, what he saw made his blood run cold. Three young men were surrounding an elderly customer, the quiet old man who came in every Tuesday to buy day-old bread. They were kicking him while he lay curled up on the ground, trying to protect himself. David dropped the box of cereal he'd been stocking and started toward the front door. But what happened next froze him in place. One of the attackers, the stocky one, grabbed the front of Marcus's thin jacket and hauled him halfway upright, apparently preparing to hit him again. The fabric, already worn thin by years of washing and weather, couldn't take the stress. The jacket tore along the front seam with a sound like a gunshot, splitting wide open and exposing Marcus's chest to the afternoon sunlight. And there, etched deep into the weathered skin over his heart, was a tattoo that made David Miller's world stop spinning. It wasn't the usual military ink that veterans carried. No eagles or flags or motivational slogans. This was something else entirely. A simple design that spoke volumes to anyone who knew what to look for. A skull wearing a naval diving helmet, crossed with a combat knife and a suppressed pistol. Underneath, in faded but still readable letters, "Silent Death." David Miller had served 8 years in the Navy before taking over his family's grocery store. He'd never been a SEAL himself, but he'd worked with them during his deployment to the Persian Gulf. He'd seen that particular tattoo exactly once before, on the arm of a SEAL operator who had eliminated 3 enemy sentries without making a sound, clearing the way for David's entire unit to complete their mission safely. Silent Death wasn't just a tattoo. It was a reputation earned in blood. The 3 college students had no idea what they were looking at. To them, it was just another piece of faded ink on an old man's chest. But to David Miller, It was a revelation that changed everything about what he was witnessing. These drunk kids weren't beating up a helpless vagrant. They were assaulting one of America's most lethal warriors. David burst through the front door of his store like a man possessed. "Get away from him!" he roared, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had learned to command in combat situations. The three attackers looked up, startled by the interruption. The tall one still had a grip on Marcus's torn jacket, holding the old man in a position where the tattoo was fully visible. "Mind your own business," the mean-eyed one snarled. "We're just teaching this homeless piece of trash some respect." "Homeless?" David's voice went deadly quiet as he approached. "You think that man is homeless?" He pointed at the exposed tattoo, his hand trembling with a mixture of rage and recognition. "Do you see that ink? You have any idea what that means?" The three college students looked down at Marcus, who was still struggling to breathe after the kicks to his ribs. The tattoo was clearly visible, but they obviously didn't understand its significance. "It's just some old tattoo," the stocky one said dismissively. "Probably got it in prison or something." David Miller had heard enough. "That's not just any tattoo," he said, his voice carrying across the parking lot. "That's the mark of a Navy SEAL, SEAL Team 5, to be specific. The silent death designation means he's eliminated more enemies than you three have brain cells combined." The effect was immediate and profound. The tall one released his grip on Marcus's jacket like it had suddenly caught fire. The stocky one took a step backward, uncertainty creeping across his face. The mean-eyed one looked between Marcus and David, trying to process what he'd just been told. "You're lying," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Am I?" David knelt beside Marcus, helping the old man sit up against the bench. Sir? What's your name?" Marcus looked up at David with eyes that held decades of pain and dignity. "Marcus Sullivan," he said quietly. "Retired Master Chief, SEAL Team." David nodded respectfully. "What years did you serve, sir?" 1963 to 1991, Marcus replied, his voice growing stronger. "3 tours in Vietnam, 2 in Central America, classified operations in the Persian Gulf." Each word hit the 3 college students like a physical blow. This wasn't some random homeless man they'd been beating. This was a decorated veteran who had served his country for nearly 3 decades. But David wasn't finished. "Sir," he said to Marcus, "would you mind if I asked about your specialty?" Marcus hesitated. Even after all these years, talking about classified operations felt wrong. But something about David's respectful tone and the situation called for honesty. "Deep reconnaissance," he said finally. "Target elimination. High-value enemy personnel." David looked up at the 3 attackers, who were now standing in stunned silence. "Gentlemen, meet Master Chief Marcus Sullivan. The man you just spent the last 10 minutes beating and calling a homeless dog has probably killed more enemy soldiers than most entire infantry units. He's conducted operations behind enemy lines that saved American lives and eliminated threats most people never even hear about." The silence that followed was deafening. Cars passed on the nearby street, shoppers walked in and out of other stores, life continued normally just a few feet away. But in that parking lot, 3 young men were coming to terms with the magnitude of their mistake. We didn't know," the tall one stammered. "No, you didn't know," David agreed. "Because you didn't ask. You saw an old man who looked poor and assumed he was worthless. You decided that gave you the right to hurt him." He helped Marcus to his feet, supporting him with gentle hands. "This man has given more for his country than you 3 will give in your entire privileged lives. And you repaid that sacrifice by kicking him while he lay on the ground." The mean-eyed one, perhaps realizing the seriousness of what they'd done, tried to salvage the situation. "Look, we're sorry. We were just drunk, you know. We didn't mean anything by it." Marcus looked at him with the kind of stare that had once made enemy soldiers surrender without a fight. "You meant every bit of it," he said quietly. "You saw someone you thought was weak, and you decided to hurt them because you could. The only thing you're sorry about is getting caught." His words carried the weight of absolute truth, and none of the 3 young men could argue with them. David was already pulling out his phone. I'm calling the police. What you did was assault, and the fact that you did it to a decorated veteran makes it even worse. Wait, the stocky one said quickly. Please don't call the cops. We'll make this right. How? David's voice was ice cold. How do you make right the fact that you beat an 82-year-old war hero while he begged you to stop? But before anyone could answer, Marcus spoke up. No police, he said quietly. David looked at him in surprise. Sir, these men assaulted you. They need to face consequences. Marcus looked at the three college students, who were standing there like children caught in a lie. They're young and stupid. Police won't fix that. But sir? No police, Marcus repeated, his voice carrying the kind of authority that ended discussions. But I want them to understand something. He turned to face his attackers directly, and when he spoke, his voice carried the quiet menace of someone who had once been America's most lethal weapon. You three picked the wrong man to hurt today. Not because of what I used to do, but because of what you chose to become. You chose to be the kind of people who hurt others for entertainment. You chose to be predators who target the vulnerable. The tall one opened his mouth to speak, but Marcus continued. I've killed men who were better human beings than you are. Enemy soldiers who fought for their beliefs, who died with honor. You don't even have that excuse. You're just bullies who found someone you thought couldn't fight back. His words hit harder than any physical blow could have. I'm not going to press charges, Marcus continued, not because you don't deserve it, but because I want you to live with what you did today. I want you to remember that you beat an old man while he begged for mercy, and I want you to ask yourselves what that makes you. The three college students stood in silence, unable to meet his eyes. David, meanwhile, was gathering up Marcus's scattered groceries. The bread was ruined, the soup can was dented, and the peanut butter container had a crack running down one side. Your groceries are destroyed, he said. Let me replace them. That's not necessary, Marcus replied. Yes, it is. David's voice brooked no argument. And not just replace them. You're going to let me set up a delivery service for you. No more 3-mile walks to buy day-old bread. No more sitting on benches where drunken college kids can use you for target practice. Marcus looked surprised. I can't afford. It's free, David interrupted. Consider it a small token of respect from one veteran to another. And if you're worried about charity, don't be. You've earned this 100 times over. As David helped Marcus toward the store to gather replacement groceries, the three college students remained standing in the parking lot, still processing what had just happened. Jesus Christ, the tall one whispered. We beat up a Navy SEAL. Not just any SEAL, the stocky one replied, pulling out his phone and doing a quick Google search. Look at this. SEAL Team 5, Vietnam era. These guys were legends. They did stuff that's still classified. The mean-eyed one, who had seemed the most aggressive throughout the attack, was staring at the spot where Marcus had fallen. For the first time in his life he was truly understanding what he had done. We're monsters, he said quietly. Inside the store, David was loading a cart with groceries, not just replacements for what had been destroyed, but enough food for several weeks. Marcus protested, but David waved off his objections. Sir, I need to ask you something, David said as they walked down the canned goods aisle. How did you end up in this situation? Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Classified service doesn't translate well to civilian job applications. When your entire career is top secret, it's hard to prove you actually did anything. I worked odd jobs for a while, but when you get older, employers don't want you. Social Security helps, but not enough. The simple explanation carried the weight of a system that had failed one of its heroes. That's going to change, David said firmly, starting today. Outside, the three college students were having a very different conversation. We need to do something, the stocky one said. We can't just walk away from this. Like what? The mean-eyed one asked. I don't know, but we just beat up a war hero, a man who fought for our freedom. That's got to mean something. The tall one was staring at his hands, the same hands that had grabbed Marcus's jacket and torn it open, revealing the tattoo that had changed everything. My grandfather was in World War II, he said quietly. He used to tell me stories about what it was like, what guys like him went through. If someone had done to him what we just— He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. When Marcus and David emerged from the store 20 minutes later, the three young men were still there, waiting, but their demeanor had completely changed. Where before they had been aggressive and mocking, now they looked genuinely remorseful. "Sir," the tall one said, approaching Marcus carefully, "we want to apologize, really apologize, not just because we got caught." Marcus looked at him without speaking. "We were drunk and stupid and cruel, and there's no excuse for what we did. You didn't deserve that, nobody deserves that, but especially not someone who served our country." The stocky one stepped forward. "Sir, is there anything we can do to make this right? Any way we can help you?" Marcus studied their faces, looking for sincerity. What he saw was three young men who had been forced to confront the worst parts of themselves and didn't like what they'd found. "You want to help me?" he asked quietly. All three nodded eagerly. "Then don't do this to anyone else. Ever. The next old man you see sitting on a bench, the next homeless veteran you encounter, the next person who looks different from you, remember this moment. Remember how it felt to realize you'd hurt someone who didn't deserve it." "We will," the mean-eyed one said, and for the first time his voice carried genuine emotion. "I swear to you we will." Marcus nodded slowly. Then maybe something good came out of this after all. As David loaded the groceries into his car to drive Marcus home, the three college students dispersed quietly, each carrying the weight of a lesson they would never forget. But the story didn't end there. Word of what had happened spread quickly through the neighborhood. David Miller told other shop owners about Marcus's situation and his service record. Within a week, a network of local businesses had formed an informal support system for the Old Seal. The barber offered free haircuts. The pharmacy provided discounted medications. The laundromat where Marcus lived waived his rent in exchange for light maintenance work he could handle. Most importantly, people began to see him not as a burden to be avoided, but as a hero to be honored. The three college students also changed. The tall one, whose name was Justin, dropped out of his fraternity and began volunteering at a local veterans center. The stocky one, called Mike, started a fundraising campaign at his university for homeless veterans. The mean-eyed one, Tom, underwent the most dramatic transformation. He changed his major to social work and dedicated his life to helping society's most vulnerable members. Years later, when Marcus Sullivan passed away peacefully in his sleep at age 87, his funeral was attended by hundreds of people whose lives he had touched. Not through his classified military service, which remained largely secret, but through the simple dignity with which he had faced his struggles and the grace with which he had forgiven those who had wronged him. Justin, Mike, and Tom were among the pallbearers, carrying the flag-draped coffin of a man who had taught them the most important lesson of their lives, that strength isn't about your ability to hurt others, but about your ability to choose kindness, even when kindness hasn't been shown to you. David Miller spoke at the service, describing how a chance encounter in a grocery store parking lot had taught an entire community about honor, service, and the importance of looking beyond appearances to see the true worth of every human being. But perhaps the most fitting tribute came from the inscription on Marcus's headstone, chosen by the three young men whose lives he had changed. Master Chief Marcus Sullivan. He taught us that heroes don't always look heroic, and that the strongest among us are often those who suffer in silence. The silent death tattoo that had shocked three college students into understanding had become a symbol of something larger, the recognition that every person carries a story, and that sometimes the most important battles are fought not on distant battlefields, but in grocery store parking lots where the choice between cruelty and compassion determines what kind of people we become. In the end, Marcus Sullivan had completed one final mission, teaching a new generation that true strength comes not from the power to hurt others, but from the wisdom to lift them up instead. And in a world that too often forgot the value of quiet heroism, that lesson lived on long after the man who taught it had found his final peace.